Hi, y'all. I'm Alex Petersen, a member of the Management of Complex Systems Department at the University of California, Merced. And in this video, I will discuss our recent work published in PNAS Nexus that analyzes how increasing digital media visibility and tourism messaging promote U.S. national park system integration. For over a century, the U.S. National Park Service has been charged with a paradoxical dual mandate to preserve invaluable environmental and cultural resources for all future generations, while also ensuring their public accessibility for recreational enjoyment. Yet, with 124 million visitors in 2019 alone, our national parks are at risk of being loved to death. Against this backdrop, in this talk, I'm going to address two key research questions. First, to what degree is the U.S. National Park System a connected system? This has important implications for system management, including system-wide policy, budgeting, branding, integration, and the assessment of supply and demand for sustainable tourism, where the product in this case is accessible, wild nature. Second, what is the role of tourism-oriented media, which has implications for visitor management, particularly the repricing of annual park passes to account for multi-park visitation. Insights from our public-oriented lens also have broader relevance for nascent national park and protected area systems that are emerging globally, raising the question of whether they should embrace accessibility as part of their mission or prioritize conservation above all. Taking this idea further, a related consideration is whether global efforts to promote sustainable ecotourism have sometimes oversold the capacity of national parks and protected areas, which can inadvertently drive increased tourism to these sites even when essential infrastructure such as trails, waste management, visitor facilities, or monitoring systems are not yet adequately developed or funded, potentially exacerbating detrimental human impacts on fragile environments rather than truly supporting long-term conservation. So with that backdrop, let's first consider the size and scope of the 63 U.S. national parks according to their variation measured by quasi-static quantities. This map illustrates the location of all 63 national parks, where links highlight pairs featuring high biogeographical relatedness, and note that the system spans every corner of the U.S. territory, extending as far as the American Samoa and the Virgin Islands, which highlights one of the principal challenges of top-down management of protected area systems, which is their fragmented structure. In order to reach its environmental protection and tourism objectives, the National Park Service depends upon the effective allocation of personnel and other resources across the system, which is daunting considering that just these 63 national parks collectively span roughly 2% of the U.S. land area. Yet with over 100 million visitors per year, this represents roughly twice as many tourists visiting New York City over the same period, yet distributed over an area over 270 times as large. Hence, the management of resource allocation is complicated by the incredibly wide size variability across the parks shown here, indicating that there is no such thing as an average park. For example, Gateway Arch is the smallest national park located in downtown St. Louis and welcomes roughly 2 million visitors annually, concentrated in an area roughly the size of UC Merced campus, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, there is Wrangell St. Elias in Alaska, the largest national park by area, roughly the size of Massachusetts, yet welcomes only 70,000 visitors per year. Now let's consider the variation across national parks according to dynamic quantities that capture the acutely complex dimensions of organizational management. Somewhat ironically, as global wealth has risen, so has the pull of the wild, fueling increases in national park visitation driven by a growing appetite for ecotourism and outdoor adventure. The panel on the left shows a time series for each national park, measuring the amount of vehicle traffic from 2010 to 2020. Note that variation in this visitation metric spans 3 orders of magnitude. In the panel on the right, each time series is rescaled to its 2010 value to highlight differences in trajectories from a common starting point. This normalization shows that traffic increased by about 29% on average over the decade, excluding 2020, when many parks were closed, which accounts for the dip in the green curve that represents the system average. Now compare the strong visitation growth from the previous slide with the digital media visibility shown here. We measure visibility by counting the number of media articles each year that mention a national park by its official name, serving as a proxy for public attention and brand visibility. On the left, notice the wide variation across parks, spanning roughly 2 orders of magnitude in any given year. And on the right, using the same normalization as before, we see a striking exponential trend with visibility increasing by more than 3,900% over the decade. In what follows, we connect these two measures, visibility and visitation, to better understand how tourism media messaging shapes growth in park visitation. Now consider these data on discretionary budget appropriations to individual parks from the U.S. Department of the Interior. We compiled these official data from the annual National Park Service Green Book budget justifications from 2000 to 2020 and adjusted them to constant 2010 dollars to track real trends. And so despite rising ecotourism demand and growing public attention, the data highlight the troubling decline in federal support to national parks. In real terms, funding fell by about 15% over the decade. Moreover, budget cuts further intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic, even as the need for park access grew, with the total 2019 NPS budget dropping from $3.2 billion by roughly 14% in 2020. With that context in place, I'll now turn to the data collection methods used to quantify national park visibility and how these lead to a measure of co-visibility across parks. As I mentioned briefly, we quantify visibility by counting how often each park appears in digital news media articles. To do this, we use the Media Cloud Project's API to query their massive database consisting of billions of news articles to identify articles featuring exact national park name matches. For example, consider an opinion piece from the New York Times titled, "Our National Parks Are in Trouble. Blame overcrowding, invasive species, climate change, and money woes," which aptly connects a number of management of complex systems challenges. The blue highlights indicate 2 explicit mentions of Denali National Park, which are the sources of name recognition that we can systematically capture. Scaling up this method to all 63 national park names, we identify all articles that mention at least one park by name, building a dataset of more than 420,000 articles spanning over 2 decades and a wide range of media outlets. Because each article has a unique identifier, it's straightforward to detect when multiple parks are mentioned together, allowing us to construct granular and consistent measures of co-visibility. These articles come from roughly 16,000 distinct media sources, providing broad coverage of the human and environmental context in which parks are discussed. And since each article is time-stamped, we can track how this media visibility ecosystem evolves over time, similar to our related work analyzing media visibility ecosystems constructed for people and research universities. Here are a couple of examples of articles featuring park co-visibility that contribute to our co-occurrence analysis. Shown on the left is another New York Times article celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the National Park Service from back in 2016, which explicitly mentions Denali and Yellowstone National Parks. And shown on the right is one of my favorite media articles featuring Grandma Joy Ryan, who had never seen a mountain until her grandson Brad took her on an epic journey to visit every national park. And I'm happy to report that after this article was featured by the Washington Post in 2022, they have since completed their grand circuit. Notably, this article specifically mentions 11 national parks. In addition, other available article-level metadata include the media source, the publication date, and most importantly, the title, which we use to classify the article's context by way of a machine learning topic classifier. Here are some descriptive publication date statistics for a sample, including the number of unique articles by year, shown on top, which distinguishes the set of articles featuring just one park from those featuring multiple parks. Indeed, both subsamples have grown dramatically over the last 2 decades, following the overall explosive growth of digital media content generation. It's worth clarifying that our sample does not include social media posts. And on the bottom is the breakdown by month, which shows that digital media content generation follows the expected seasonality of outdoor recreational tourism in the US. Together, these data facilitate developing a system science framework for quantifying media co-visibility across the entire ensemble of national parks over time. Importantly, quantifying national park co-visibility between any parks A and B provides a proxy for an otherwise challenging thing to measure, namely co-visitation, or how many people in a particular year visited both parks A and B, which is an important question that we save for future work. Instead, here we focus on identifying the degree to which particular media messages correlate with co-visibility of national parks. To give you a sense of how common this co-visibility is, here's a time series showing the percentage of articles each year that mention 2 or more different national parks. This roughly 13% subsample of articles featuring multiple national parks are roughly uniformly distributed across time, and this subset helps us directly address our 2 research questions, one on system integration, and the second analyzing the extent to which tourism messaging correlates with co-visibility, which we posit to be a double-edged sword driving system integration. Okay, finally, for some results. Shown here is a co-occurrence matrix calculated over the entire 21-year sample, accounting for all national park pairs, with co-occurrences ranging from 1 article upwards of several thousand articles, as in the case of Yellowstone and Grand Teton. Importantly, digital media connect all but 1 pair of national parks, and the wide variation across the matrix provides valuable perspectives for understanding the latent structure of the entire system according to principles of relatedness, in particular extending beyond the traditional dimension of spatial proximity to include other more abstract dimensions such as biogeographical similarities and socio-political and historical contexts. Note the black bands on the top and left sides of the matrix label discrete communities identified according to an unsupervised machine learning algorithm. Indeed, the most prominent community in the upper left accurately identifies the system's most iconic crown jewel parks. One key insight from this community structure is that prestige stratification, or differences in perceived fame or status, explains park co-visibility far better than geographic proximity. To assess the degree to which the system has integrated over time, shown here is a time series measuring system integration according to a normalized measure of co-occurrence that ranges between 0 and 1. In other words, the fraction of all possible articles that feature multiple parks. Notably, this system integration metric reached a level corresponding to a 1.7% article co-occurrence rate in 2020, with notable spikes along the way corresponding to exogenous marketing shocks, specifically the National Park Quarter Series and the 2016 Centennial. But also of note was the 2007-08 financial crisis, which triggered the downfall of the long-standing print news industry and ushered in the present-day deluge of digital media content production. The time series at the bottom illustrates why the paradigm shift in news media mattered so much. It reoriented content production around the digital marketing attention economy. This shift produced clear upticks in media topics tied to travel, vacations, and leisure, while coverage of other contexts associated with the protected area and crisis management mandates did not appreciate to the same degree. Hence, digital media increasingly framed national parks as desirable leisure destinations rather than primarily as sites of natural science, conservation challenges, or ecological crises. This highlights one of our key insights, that as digital media visibility tends to focus attention on tourism-oriented topics, this risks diverting attention from critical conservation messages such as environmental sustainability, wildfire management, and wildlife conservation. We exploit our large and comprehensive sample of media article titles to track shifts in the topic space of national park-related media messaging. We leverage these granular yet concise titles, sufficiently informative for classification, to apply a machine learning classifier trained on Facebook posts. It assigns weights to each article across 10 topic categories, shown here in this pie chart, enabling us to quantify how media framing has evolved over time. For example, this article titled "A Road Trip to Death Valley, Salt Flats, Chilly Nights, and Kitsch is correctly identified as being tourism-oriented. We use this consistent classification of individual article titles to calculate an average topic distribution for each national park. This aggregated topic vector represents the average media framing in articles mentioning that particular park. For example, shown here are the topic distributions for Yosemite and Arches national parks, two crown jewels, in which 22% and 28% of topics are tourism-oriented, respectively, as indicated by the black segment in each pie chart and the number at its center. To test for differences in topical composition, in particular relating to the role of tourism-oriented media on system integration, we compare the subset of articles that mention both parks simultaneously, in other words, the intersection of the Yosemite and Arches article samples, to the complementary sample of articles that only mention Arches or Yosemite but not both. In this case, the subsample conditioned by Arches Yosemite co-occurrence features a 29% frequency of tourism-oriented topics, which is in excess of the value calculated for the other two parks individually. Hence, to obtain a single, clear comparison, we calculate a relative ratio by dividing the tourism-oriented topic frequency in the intersection, again based upon articles mentioning both parks, by the corresponding baseline frequency in the complementary samples, based upon the union set of articles mentioning each park individually. In this case, the ratio is 1.31. This ratio indicates a non-incremental 31% excess of tourism-oriented messaging in the co-occurring articles relative to those featuring the parks separately. We can then assign a statistical significance to this difference in the ratios by way of a one-sided Zeitz test, which in this case establishes that R is greater than 1 at the P less than 0.001 level. Having described that methodology for pairwise comparisons of tourism-oriented media frequencies, we can readily scale it up to the entire ensemble of 1,953 park pairs. For the sake of example, the lower diagonal elements of this matrix display the relative tourism frequency ratios calculated among the top 10 national parks according to recreational visitation. Notably, there is a prevalence of R greater than 1 values, the majority of which are statistically significant. And so while this pattern is somewhat expected, given that these are highly visited crown jewel parks, it is not solely attributable to geographic proximity, as the varying colors of the national park name labels indicate their dispersion across distinct U.S. regions. To fully appreciate the bias towards R greater than 1 values across the entire system, shown here is the frequency distribution of R values calculated across all national parks in green, as well as just for the top 10 visited parks from the previous slide in magenta, which we would naively expect to have larger R values than on the aggregate. Indeed, this is the case. Among all national park pairs, 25% have R greater than 1 values that are statistically significant at the 5% level. And among the top 10 national parks, according to visitation, this percentage increases to 76%. Hence, this result conclusively indicates that national park co-visibility promotes tourism in excess of other media narratives. Finally, we can take every national park pair featuring an R greater than 1 value at the 1% statistical significance level and see to what extent these pairs connect the entire system of parks. Shown here is the network representation according to that condition, where parks are the nodes sorted according to recreational tourism, starting with Great Smoky Mountains National Park and extending counterclockwise. The first thing to note is that the entire system is connected, with the exception of 2 parks highlighted in red, which do become connected if we raise the threshold to the 5% level. Moreover, these connections are not just among the most highly visited parks, as there is no radial bias in our circular network, but instead, they extend across all pairs of all tourism levels. This key insight implies that even a narrowly targeted tourism marketing campaign could readily spread across the entire system. It also suggests that the multi-park visitation follows similar principles of structural connectivity. So this leads us to our joint take-home message, which is that despite national parks fostering public appreciation necessary to protect natural capital, The emergence of ecotourism marketing, coupled with a growing global tourist population, have rendered visitation growth unsustainable and is likely to exacerbate the paradox of sustainable tourism management. Hence, the paradox facing the National Park Service has become more nuanced. While greater integration of national parks into the public sphere may foster deeper appreciation for parks and protected areas as interconnected human environmental systems, heightened media co-visibility could also drive increased co-visitation. This, in turn, may intensify pressures on already strained administrative capacities and fragile ecosystems, particularly in the context of declining budgetary support. Thank you for your attention. Please see our published study for more details and extended analyses of the dynamics of system integration, illustrated here by this co-occurrence matrix. And also a special thanks to the National Park Rangers for their service protecting our national treasures, and the University of California Natural Reserve System, in particular Yosemite Field Station, for hosting various activities that were inspirational to this work, and the National Parks Institute at the University of California, Merced.